Hey, I'm at it. You want to talk about weapons?
I'm ready.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the first video of our weapon series where we will talk about on how to train and use everything from shivs, shanks, sticks, staffs, staves, swords, and spears. So some of y'all might be going like, but medics, like those are all like very different things or different versions of different things. How can you be accomplished or good at all of them? Well, that's the thing, is that they're handheld weapons and they all have similar basic attack patterns and defensive patterns, except for a few nuances relative to whatever that weapon happens to be. And one of the best examples is just basic attack patterns. If anybody has ever been interested in knives or anything whatsoever, you've probably heard of the name Doug Marcaida. He's been one of the bladesmith judges on the show Force and Fire for essentially season 1. I became familiar with him years before that simply because I was looking up knife stuff, and he is a practitioner and teacher of Kali, or some people call it Arnis or Eskrima. Kind of different name for almost the same things. Kali is pretty heavy in knife work, but they also use sticks as well. But if you watch any of his videos where Doug is talking about how to attack with a knife or a weapon, whichever, you'll hear him talking about using the face of a clock, or a clock face. And he'll usually say, like, you're going from 12 to 6, you're going from 1 to 7, 9 to 3, and that's a fairly good pattern. The only problem, though, is that analogy, while very, very good, there's typically not a lot of actual clock faces nowadays for especially, current generations and stuff like that. I'm sure we've all heard some of the horrifyingly ignorant questions that younger generations have asked, and it's not their fault, it's just the changing of times. So while some people use a clock face, which is perfectly fine, I tend to stay with the basic pie pattern, 8 different sections of a circle, because pretty much people are still learning how to do pie charts, and it's a very easy thing for them to visualize. So I tend to use a pie pattern mostly because whether it's with a knife, you still go up, down, over, and across. I'm still doing a pie pattern. So I can do that the same whether I'm using a knife, a sword, a staff, or even a longer staff or a bow. But primarily what I want to kind of go over with this video is grips. Different grips, changing grips a little bit, and how to train, quote unquote, train grips. A really good video to look at different types of grips, especially the evolution of grips, depending on the times or the era, the culture, and just the basic change in sword design. There's already a video kind of going over all that stuff made by Skalagrim where he talks about several different grips. I highly suggest that you go watch that video. The only thing that I'm going to talk about different than what he does is I don't have any rapiers, so I'm not really going to go over much of the different types of grips for rapiers, and the grips for rapiers only apply for rapiers. You can kind of use what's called a saber grip, or what he calls a handshake grip, which is your hand kind of sticking out and the blade just kind of sits in the hand like this. However, because of the nature of rapiers, they are primarily a thrusting weapon. The grip actually changes to where the handle or the blade winds up being more and more in line with your forearm and your wrist, so you have better thrusting capabilities. Can rapiers cut? Yes, they can, but their primary purpose is stabbing. So primarily when it comes to single-hand or two-handed bladed weapons, you're mostly going to run into 2 types of grips. You're going to run into, again, your saber or handshake grip, or a hammer grip. Typically, you can do both these grips with blade up or blade down. There is an entire argument about reverse blade stuff. I get it. It is an entirely very situational type thing and a major skill issue. More than anything, this would be more of a transition type thing or a supported hand type thing. You're very rarely ever actually going to attack just with this, because it's generally not that strong and you do shorten your reach quite a bit. But you can still do a hammer grip and your handshake or saber grip. This grip particularly is primarily good for if you're using it as some kind of blunt impact thrusting weapon. There are instances, primarily in Japanese arts, where when the sword is still in the scabbard here, they would actually come in, hit or make contact with the handle, either on the opponent's wrist or hitting within the chest or somewhere, and then going into some type of attack. However, when they do this, they are in very, very close range. So the shortening of the range of the sword doesn't much matter. But it is still important to be very familiar with this, because you can be using it as some type of transitioning to go into either fishing around with the blade or going into a supported roll where you grab the blade, or you grab the flat, non-sharp parts of the blade, not the actual sharp part. Although there are techniques on how to grab the sharp part of the blade without injuring yourself, but preferably you're not having to do that, especially with a bare hand. You might have a gauntlet or some kind of protective mitt. So to figure out the two grips, there's a hammer grip, very simple. You're going to hold the weapon, whichever it is. It can be a knife, sword, stick, whatever, doesn't matter. You will hold the weapon vertically, and then you will grab the weapon basically in just a perpendicular right angle. Your wrist can create the forward and backward or flexion that you would need in order to operate the weapon in defensive capabilities or offensive. Like now, in order to find the handshake grip, and the best way I've so far kind of heard on how to find or establish a handshake or saber grip was actually from an anime about tennis. And it's an anime called The Prince of Tennis. And so I can't remember if the explanation was given in the first episode or the second episode. It's very early on. But essentially, the main character essentially explained that how you hold a racket, like you don't hold it in a death grip or anything like that, and same thing for weapons and stuff, is he told the person to lay the racket down on the floor. And then when you reach down, that's not going to stay. When you reach down to grab and pick it up, that is essentially kind of the grip that you're going to have. I almost have the saber grip here. I just kind of need to firm it up a little bit, but that's a fairly easy way to figure out on how to establish this type of grip.
I'll be as loud as I want.
There you go. When you're holding onto the racket like you're picking it up off the ground, that's how you do an actual Western grip.
What'd you say?
And just so you know, that handshake grip you were rambling about earlier is really the Eastern grip. Lots of people get those mixed up, so don't feel too bad about it.
Now, since I primarily deal with, like, as you can see, kind of Japanese style weaponry a little bit, I tend to operate my weapons like Japanese styles, which is generally front hand is your main controller, your driver, your steering wheel, and the back hand provides most of the power. So because of that, my front hand is firm, but again, not super tight, because it has to be able to move and pivot the way that it needs to. And a very recent video, at least at the time of recording, a channel named Shadiveristy, where they are kind of going over some comments that people had about how to correctly use a katana. To be perfectly honest, a sharp metal thing is a sharp metal thing, as long as it cuts. Yippee. But one of the things that I really noticed is the two hosts, Shad and Tyrant, at this current time, they both held the katana in the technically correct way, instead of having this being the main power driver, I guess, within European arts, where Japanese style, this is the primary power driver. Tyrant, his forehand grip, if there's a Suko or handguard here, his was fairly close and didn't have a whole lot of space right here. And you could see all of his fingers. It's very important. For him, both grips, the Japanese way and the European way, kind of felt all the same. But then when Shad held the sword, this forefinger essentially disappeared, and his middle finger went way up here. And he had this massive space between the crook of his thumb or the bend of his thumb to the handguard. And for a grip like that, seems actually not to have a whole lot of control, because one, you're actually projecting it more in a stabbing type fashion, but it also dramatically changes on how much leverage that your backhand has in order to generate that power. So I don't know what exactly prompted him to find that particular grip when it comes to Japanese styles. He has gone to Japan and learned Japanese sword. I don't particularly know what style he did or how much actual training for that grip to be ingrained inside him. It was just a style of, I guess, the handshake or saber grip that I had never really seen when it came to Japanese weaponry. Now, as for the backhand, the power hand, depending on the school, they might have you do it in certain ways. Some styles, whether it's Eastern or even European, you might be grabbing below the pommel or the end cap of the handle. It is dependent upon, again, style, but also the particular sword that you're using and what feels most comfortable. You might be up on the guard. You might even sometimes be hand to hand like this. This would be more particular if you're using something more like a hammer grip, or if you're using something that's closer to like a hand or a hand and a half grip for European style swords. For knives, we kind of have the same thing. We have a hammer grip, we have a slight saber grip, depending on how long the handle is and the general blade construction. This would be a fairly large knife to generally carry around because this is about an 8-inch blade. A significant number of states within the United States does not allow you to carry something this large, especially in New York or California. I think they limit it to like maybe 2-inch blades or like barely bigger than that. But there are some places that don't have any restrictions. However, don't walk down the street with like a machete or something like that. You will get stopped. You know you will. But one of the things with knives as well is that not only do you hold it in the conventional way, but there's also various instances where you do have it in a reverse type grip. Now, what are the benefits of holding a knife in a reverse type grip? Well, for one, especially if you do any kind of art that involves trapping methods, it is much easier to trap someone's arm or manipulate someone's arm in a downward or reverse grip position. It's simply that your leverage is much better. If I'm pulling this way, I have much better leverage here than I do here. It's like the way that our hands are designed, the basic concept, especially if you want to get out of like wrist grabs or anything like that, is you go towards the thumb from the bottom. So you could technically, if you see any kind of knife disarms or anything, they are hitting the blade in such a way that the handle comes up. And you can do the exact same thing by grabbing someone's hand. I have had men significantly bigger than me grab me with one hand. Two hands does make it considerably more difficult. But grab with one hand as tight as they can. I let them lock down, and by just simply, the joke that we do, honestly, if you do it right, is you just have them grab. You go, "Are you got me? Are you really sure?" And then you literally just bring your hand up and like scratch your head as if you're going to talk, and then she's like, "Why'd you let go? Grab me." It's that easy. Essentially, you just take your thumb, and when someone grabs you, you just literally just take your thumb, come up, and you can get out. You do have to put some effort in, especially when they are a huge size difference. So that's why when it comes to trapping, it's considerably harder to do it this way versus this way. This is the primarily good reason to do reverse grip with knives. It does make it easier for you to manipulate either your opponent's limbs, or if you can get around their neck, you can do a lot of pulling and stuff and cranking like that while then going into a cut. The other reason that you would probably want to practice reverse grip with a knife is if you're someone who is primarily hands striking, it is far easier to start incorporating a knife into your work in a reverse grip, because literally all you have to do, if this is the center line of my opponent, instead of punching directly at them like I would typically, I just actually shoot off to the side, boom, and past my opponent here. Okay, so instead of aiming, here in the face like I typically would, in which case the blade would make contact, maybe not cut, but by reaching across and past, I'm more likely to get a cut on the person. And it does kind of project the blade out when you do go at an angle this way. So it does give you a little bit of reach. So grips, when it comes to sticks, staves, and staffs, what are the difference between those? Figure it out on your own. It's basically something that doesn't have a blade to it. It's just a blunt instrument. For this weapon that I have here, it is a Jo. It is a Japanese weapon, typically around about 4 feet long. The cool thing about a Jo is you can swing it like a bokken or wooden sword with just a little bit more reach. You can use both ends like a staff generally. You just don't have the reach of a staff because it's considerably longer. This would be closer to what you would hear about, people using a walking stick while traveling or anything like this. This is a very good weapon. This is probably a good 1.25 inches of hardwood. This would take a lot of punishment and do a lot of damage to people. Primarily because with blunt force, you don't have to be nearly as precise as you might have to be with a blade. You literally just smash until broken. But when it comes to grips, you can do the same basic grips we've talked about. Hammer grip or saber handshake grip, you can grab the end, but you can also slide your hands or change grips, change end pieces, however you want. And it's just getting comfortable of your basic attack patterns and just moving your weapon through space. So you can go with kind of more classical stick fighting to where one hand is facing one way, the other hand is facing another. For those of you that have done deadlift, this is the conventional deadlift type grip, right? Alternating grip. For this way, you have fairly good power with downward strikes, but also upward strikes without having to compromise your grip. Very good thrusting ability because you can literally just treat it like a jab, except your reach is now considerably longer. Or you can let the weapon slide through your front hand while pushing the backhand forward and really increase your reach. I move back simply because it can kind of almost stay in frame, it still goes out. But say you're here, opponent is there, 1, 2, and then thrust. And I get a far longer reach than if I was just to thrust normal. And then you get into weapons that are quite a bit longer, whether they be bow or staffs, the English translation, or you get into spears and pole arms. For those, you actually wind up sometimes having both ends having some kind of weaponized end piece. One side might have a blade and or blunt instrument. Other side might have a counterweight or a spike, simply because now both ends can do considerably more damage than just blunt force trauma. Especially actual spears that were used on battlefields, especially during the Greek or hoplite warfare type era. You would have your primary spear point on one end and then a slightly heavier counterweight that might be in the shape of a spike as well. Same thing with types of pole arms, depending on the weight distribution and the construction. Both ends might have a sharp end as well. So I know this has kind of been a long video, especially considering the other ones that we have done, but I just want to go over some of the general weapons that we will be going over and or learning about, and the types of grips and manipulations that you can do with those weapons. The primary thing that I will always suggest, I suggest it for unarmed and unarmed training, is the value, the highly, highly important value of play. You really have to be willing and capable. Capable is very important to play with the things that you learn, especially when it comes to weapons. People might ask in some instances, like, why are you doing like weird flurry, flippy, spinny type stuff? Does it have any value? Depending on the weapon system, maybe. By and large, kind of no. But that's in actual fighting. Within training, the primary reason that you would do this spinning and manipulation stuff or any kind of catch release things is you become very comfortable with handling your weapon. So that if you do start to fumble it or someone happens to hit the weapon out of one of your hands, you can quickly recapture the weapon, get back into the fight, and hopefully not be undefended. So whether you do that with a sword, please use training weapons when you do that type of stuff. Please do not do it with anything that actually can really hurt you. But whether you do it with swords or sticks, it is very important for you to learn to play. And especially if anybody wants to learn how to use nunchucks, they look flashy, they look cool. Not very practical, but using a stick that is roughly the same overall length of whatever your nunchuck length will be can actually be very valuable, because especially like I did earlier, this is a very common move. If I can't do this with a stiff straight weapon, then when I add something that has flex in the middle and more variables, it's going to be far harder in order for me to do. But because I do this stuff, right, I learn how to manipulate my weapon in order to make sure I don't drop it.
Drop it like it's hot. Drop it like it's hot.
So I hope that was good enough for y'all today. Please stay tuned for the rest of our weapon series that we'll be doing. And I'm Matic, and I'll catch y'all later.